Today I'm building this walnut floating shelf with some drawers. So I'm starting out with the top. The clients don't want any ingrain showing on the top shelf because we're going to do a Ceruse finish, and the finish doesn't look that great on ingrain. So I'm resawing some walnut to veneer a plywood substrate. I want to wrap all the sides of the top and miter all the corners so we won't have any ingrain showing. Once I had all the strips cut, I sent them through the planer to remove the saw marks and bring them down to just less than an 1/8 inch thickness. I prepped my plywood substrate by cutting it a little oversized in length and width. The finished top is going to be just under 2 inches thick, so I veneered both sides of 2 pieces of plywood. Veneering both sides helped ensure the plywood would not cup and also made up the thickness I needed. Once the glue was set, I pulled it out of the vacuum bag and squared it up at the table saw. Now that I have the top and bottom veneered, I ripped some solid wood to width to use as the front edge for the top. I'm using solid wood to band the front edge since I don't have to worry about wood movement in the vertical direction. Since I'm going to miter the front edge along its full length, I took my time at the joiner squaring it up. If any little part of it is off, it'll make it difficult to pull that long of a miter tight along its full length. Then when I went to miter the piece, I set up a feather board to prevent it from wandering away from the fence to ensure a perfect miter. I cut this piece long enough so I could use it to wrap around the sides. I am marking each end with a 1 and a 2, so when I cut them apart I can keep track of which piece goes on which end. This way when I miter the ends, the grain will flow around the corner and across the front looking like it's one continuous piece. Since the sides were already mitered, the pointy ends are really fragile, so I put a piece of tape across the cut to prevent it from chipping. I set up a stop block on the end of the table to ensure I would cut the top, bottom, and front edges at the exact same length. If any one of the three are off just a little, the miters on the end caps won't line up. Once I had them cut to length, I ripped a 45-degree bevel on both the top and bottom pieces, bringing them to their final width. I'm getting ready to glue up the top, so I'm arranging the edges so the grain blends together. This way when it's glued up it'll look like it's one piece. When I did this assembly, I used blue tape to help pull the miter tight as I worked my way down the edge. For the end caps, I left them a little long, so once I had the top assembled, I marked and cut them to length before gluing them in place. Now I'm moving on to the sides of the case. I want to cut the sides and drawer fronts out of one piece of wood so the grain flows continuously from one side across all 3 drawers and down the other side. So I milled up one board all at once to its final thickness and then went to the miter saw and cut the sides for the case off of each end. I cut a dado in each side to accept the bottom piece. I used floating tenons to attach the sides to the top and did a test fit. I made sure everything was square and set the bottom in position and marked where to cut it. The drawer dividers are going to be attached to the bottom with dados, so I set up a stacked dado head in my table saw and marked the edge of the dado on the fence. This gave me a reference to line up the bottom when cutting the dados. I'm using a French cleat to hang the cabinet from the wall, so I did a test fit so I could mark and cut a piece to length. I ripped it in half at the table saw. One half will be attached to the cabinet, the other will be attached to the wall to hang it from. Next, I held in place the pieces for the drawer dividers so I could mark and cut them to length. I did another dry assembly so I could square up the dividers and mark an edge to use as a reference to cut the mortises for the floating tenons. I took the time to clamp a stop block in place to help prevent the domino from sliding. This is a critical placement. If they are off and the dividers aren't square, it will be a huge pain to fit the drawers when I get to that step. Finally, I'm ready to assemble the case. I strategically left a gap in the clamps so I could slide in the French cleat and glue it into place. When I did the assembly, I made sure to line up the front of the cabinet so any discrepancy would end up on the back, which was easily taken care of with a hand plane. Once the case was assembled, I moved on to cutting the material to length for the drawer boxes. I used my lead jig to cut the joinery for the drawers. I left the sides long so I could just drop the partially assembled drawer in place and mark where to cut them to length. After cutting them to length, I set up my stacked dado head to cut a rabbet to attach the back to the drawer. Then readjusted the cutter to cut a dado for the bottom. I was careful to place the dado so it would pass between the dovetails and not show through on the ends when assembled. I will do the final assembly of the drawers after I finish the insides. Now I'm prepping for the Ceruse finish by blowing out any dust in the grain of the wood. I want to open up the grain so the paint will fill it in. Before doing the cerusing, I applied a few coats of poly to seal the wood so the paint wouldn't stain it and just fill in the grain. Once I got a few sealer coats down, I applied the paint. Instead of working with the grain like you would normally, I worked it across the grain, working the paint into the grain as deep as I could. At this point, you want to avoid rubbing with the grain as you might wipe out the paint, defeating the purpose. I let the paint dry just to the point that it was sticky, and then I came back and buffed off as much of the excess as I could, just leaving behind what was in the grain. If you like the shabby look, you can stop here, but we're going for a more refined look. So I put a buffing pad on my sander and buffed off the ugly. Once the paint was fully dried, I assembled the drawer. I test fitted each drawer and adjusted the fit with a block plane until I got a nice fit. Now I went and got that board I had set aside earlier for the drawer fronts. I started by cutting the center drawer first and installed it. I used some CA glue with the activator to help hold it in place until I got the handles installed. Then I used some 16th inch shims to space the drawers so I could mark and cut the end pieces. I applied the Ceruse finish to the drawer fronts, and then it was time to install the drawer handles. I found the center of the drawer and marked it on some tape. Then I used a jig that I had pre-made with the hole pattern for the handles. This way I would not have to measure for each drawer. I clamped it in place and drilled for the handles. There it is, a walnut floating shelf with drawers and a Ceruse finish. If you'd like to see what projects I'm working on for future videos with more details on my process, please join me on Patreon. I owe a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for helping me make these videos. And as always, if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell to be notified when the next video comes out.